right. Well,
Yep.
everybody, welcome back to the Homesteading Academy after a brief hiatus. We've actually got a few more programs coming up, and Kate and I are still working on additional topics. But I guess you drew the short straw today. We're going to actually tap into Kate's expertise. Kate actually has worked in fruit trees for her graduate work and worked at our Snyder farm in the orchards quite a bit. And it's one of the most common questions I think we get is about planting fruit trees. For some people, it's a real mystery what to do. So hopefully Kate's going to unlock that mystery for you and help you get started. So it's all yours, Kate.
I will certainly do my best. It's exciting to be back with the Homesteading Academy after a couple months off, like Bill said, and also very pleased to see many of our regulars, but also a lot of new faces. So thank you for being with us today. After about 1.5 years of running these webinars, you finally get to hear from me about planting fruit trees. If I can move my slides. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to give us a little bit of the lay of the land. In terms of our agenda, we'll start by talking about site preparation, which I would say is the most important thing, because if you do everything right after getting your fruit trees in the ground, it's all for nothing if you haven't properly chosen your site and prepared your site to support those trees for the next 15 to 30 years of their lifespan. We'll also dive into decision making for variety and rootstock selection. There are so many choices out there for the type of fruit, and also the cultivars that you'll choose and the rootstock that it will be planted on. And so we'll kind of try to fuss out the best decisions for your site. We'll talk about the planting procedure, of course, what to do when your plants arrive and how to get them in the ground for a long-term success. And then we'll talk a little bit about maintaining those plants through the first year. Trying to get them successful in that establishment year is absolutely critical to their long-term productivity. And at the end, I'll just touch on some resources for your continued learning. As I was preparing this presentation, I kind of felt the pain of some of our previous presenters where you have such a large topic to cover in not a lot of time. And so I wanted to make sure we have plenty of resources that you can refer to as you start to plant trees on your own property. So specifically, I wanted to begin with a mention of scale, because I recognize that a lot of people attending our Homesteading Academy webinars are coming from different places, different circumstances. And so you might be here because you're interested in planting just a single tree at your house, like this picture here on the left. Or you might be interested in planting a small orchard. I would call this kind of a pedestrian orchard, where you expect the trees to get large. You've left a lot of space between the trees and it's easy to maneuver between them. But it's not on the full commercial scale that we see here on the right, where you have a complete trellis system, you have a very high density orchard. And so there's a lot that goes into decision making based on the type of system that you're trying to produce. So regardless of the scale of your production, it's important to choose a good site. And with fruit trees, particularly with stone fruit, that means stone fruit would be like our peach trees, cherry, plums, things like that. They are particularly susceptible to issues with root rot. And so good drainage is absolutely critical for siting your fruit trees. And I've included a reference here to the NRCS Web Soil Survey. If you're not familiar with the Web Soil Survey, it's an online tool developed by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, a branch of the USDA. And basically you can put in your address and draw a map around your property, and it will tell you about the soil type there. It will tell you about the drainage and how suitable it might be for producing fruit trees. You also want to consider proximity to your house and also to your neighbor's properties or any other structures on the property. I think with siting fruit trees, people often don't realize how large they'll actually get. And also fruit trees do require or in order to be successful, a lot of times you do need to make pesticide applications to the trees. And so you need to think about proximity with that as well. I've included this image here to talk about, or to help us understand more about siting, because one of the concerns we have with fruit trees is frost. So you want to make sure that you're siting your fruit trees, if you have a larger property, in an area where you have a little bit of a slope, because what happens is the frost settles in pockets. In this example here, that would be like site D. That would be a site that we would not recommend for planting fruit trees, because the frost would tend to settle there and you would have a greater risk of frost damage to your flower buds. And so what we'd be looking for would be something like site A here, where you have a gentle slope, or site C. The difference between those two would be that A has a southern exposure, so it would warm up quicker, and C would just warm up a little bit slower. B, we would probably not prefer because of this hilltop exposure to the prevailing wind, and so that might cause damage. And then if we look over here to site F, this is something also important to talk about. You see how site F down the hill here has a hedgerow, or rather more like a forest. And the thing about that is when the frost starts to come down the hill, it will settle and be held in place by these trees here. And so it's preferable to not have these trees that will hold the frost over the orchard. And I also put a note in here about very rich or overly fertile soil. You might be encouraged to try to develop a very fertile site, but if fruit trees are overly fertilized, then they can grow too quickly, which puts them at a greater risk for some diseases such as fire blight and other concerns. So site preparation is absolutely key. I oftentimes find that low soil pH is the most common limitation. And unfortunately, it's something that takes a long time to correct. It's not the case that you can put limestone down and be able to plant, the next week. It can take a year or two for soil to fully react with limestone. And so I just included here a picture of a soil test result I received just last week. And they wanted to plant apples as the secondary crop, or they wanted recommendations for apples as the secondary crop here. And you can see that the soil pH is 5.25. And the recommended range for fruit production is 6.6 to 7.2. And so as I advised this person, it will take them at least a year, if not longer, to improve soil pH to the level that we would recommend for planting fruit trees. And I've noted here that it's critical for perennial systems, because when you plant these trees, that's your one shot for the next 15, 20, 25 years at that site. Of course, you can apply limestone to the surface if soil pH becomes a concern down the road. But it's better to have the limestone incorporated with the soil, and that's something you can only do prior to planting. So it's very important to collect soil samples from your potential site for planting fruit trees, so that we can make these adjustments prior to planting. And also I want to point out that fertility amendments, such as in this case, you see that the soil phosphorus is quite low. We want to get that above 100 pounds per acre prior to planting. That also needs to be applied pre-plant. Additionally, another piece of site preparation is your pre-plant weed control. I've included photos here from my master's project. As Bill mentioned, I did my master's project on in apples. It was high density, or weed control for high density organic apple production. And in an organic system, if that's your intention, pre-plant weed control is even that much more important, because you have less tools for managing weeds as opposed to a conventional system. And so here we see some of our major perennial weeds like our asters, goldenrods, and on the lower left is hedge bindweed, and that's completely covered these apple trees. And something I learned through doing this project is that it's important to basically take control of the site several years in advance of planting, because here the site was left fallow. So all of these, basically it turned into a meadow. So of course we had lots of perennial species to fill the space there. like our goldenrods and asters and things. And when the site was only plowed, 10 months before planting the apple trees, we didn't have any control over these weeds. They simply regrew and competed very strongly with our apple trees. And I mentioned that it's very important in an organic system to make these changes to the weed seed bank and to the perennial weeds, but it's also important in a high density system where you're trying to plant more trees per acre, because these trees have a smaller root system and they're more susceptible to competition from weeds. So I've suggested here that you either plant a cover crop for several years in advance, or you use the stale seed bed method. And if you're not familiar with that, basically that's repeated cultivation so that you get a flush of weeds and then you terminate them prior to their ability to set seed and refurbish the weed seed bank. And again, avoid fallowing like was the case prior to planting this orchard. Additionally, site preparation, you might think about planting a sod. This is a photo from, of course, a commercial orchard, but even on a smaller scale, it's very common to plant a sod around where you're going to plant your trees, because the sod helps with erosion control. It also helps with nutrient retention and weed control between the rows, but it also helps make sure that you can get in there easily with your equipment, or even on foot after a rainfall, or just during a wetter year. It's very common to plant tall fescue or a hard fescue between the rows, as you see here, and that's best done the fall or even a full year before planting the apple tree, so it can really get established, and then you can just work the ground in your planting rows or in your specific planting locations prior or when you're ready to plant the trees. So in terms of species selection, there's a lot of fruit trees that can be grown in our area. I mentioned apples, peaches, nectarines, plums, other stone fruit, pears. There's a lot of types of fruit that can be grown in our region. But it's important for you to think whether you're just a home gardener, a homesteader, or whether you're trying to market these fruit to the community. What can you feasibly eat, sell, or preserve? How will you do that? How will you handle all of the fruit that you are planning to produce? You also need to think about, kind of a self-evaluation about the space that you have, the time that you have, and the resources available to you, both financial and also in terms of your infrastructure at your site. Because managing multiple species of fruit certainly complicates things. You might be pruning at different times, fertilizing at different times, harvesting at different times. And so this can really take up a lot of your time if having a fruit orchard or even a few fruit trees is just a small part of what you're doing. And again, where will you store the fruit? Because like apples can be stored for a very long time, but they need the proper conditions. And that's not something that we typically have on our homes or even on a small scale. Okay, so let's talk about variety and rootstock selection. So if you're not familiar with the term rootstock, I wanted to, kind of give you the lay of the land here. So when you buy a fruit tree, basically you're getting 2 trees for the price of 1 in most cases. So you're getting the scion, which is the fruit variety that you want to grow. That's your Honeycrisp or your Gala apple, or your Saturn peach. That's what's growing on the top part of the tree. But that is not the part of the plant that's actually in the ground. Your desirable variety is grafted onto a rootstock, which is a different tree. It could even be a different species of tree that provides some benefit to that scion. So perhaps it enhances fruit production overall. Perhaps it provides greater winter hardiness or disease resistance. And so you have to think not only about the type of fruit that you want to grow and harvest, but you also have to think about the characteristics that you need in your rootstock to be successful at your given site. And so more specifically, I wanted to talk about some more of the attributes for both your variety and your rootstock. So each of those will have disease resistance and or susceptibility to certain diseases. So for example, Liberty apple is a type of apple that is scab or has some resistance to apple scab, which is a major disease of apples. You'll notice a lot of my references are to apples. Of course, all of this applies to other types of pome or stone fruit, but apples are where my background is, so I just tend to use apples as a reference. Additionally, you need to think about the mature tree size. So here in this graphic, you should know that an apple tree that's not on a rootstock that's planted directly in the ground could be as large as 30 to 40 feet. And so one of the reasons that we started putting fruit trees grafted onto a different rootstock is to control the size. And so we have various levels of dwarfing that you can get with different rootstocks, as you see in the photo here. So think about the mature tree size. And sure, it would be nice in a lot of cases to have trees that are only 6 or 7 feet tall. It's very easy to pick from the ground. You're not using a ladder for pruning and harvesting. But at the same time, a smaller tree requires more support. Whereas a larger tree, we might call that a semi-dwarf tree that could get, up to 14 feet or so. That tree could stand on its own and not necessarily require the trellis. So these are things to think about. As I mentioned, cold hardiness, as well as productivity, and also time to maturity. So how long does it take that tree, the combination of the rootstock and the scion, to produce a mature fruit load? You should also know that certain varieties of fruit trees are not susceptible, but they're more prone to biennial bearing. So you might have basically a bumper crop one year and then little to no fruit the next year. And so having a certain rootstock can help you to curb biennial bearing, as well as several future talks on training and pruning and thinning of your fruit that can also assist with biennial bearing. And again, if it's for home use, you want to think about your preference for flavor. How long is the shelf life? How will you preserve these fruits for future use by you, your family, or your community? Sorry. Okay. So, you've gone through the process of choosing a good site. You've gotten it all, or you're understanding how to get it all ready for planting. And now you want to understand, what type of tree should I buy? If you've been going to, your local home improvement store or garden center, you're probably seeing potted fruit trees out like this photo here on the right. But you're not seeing these bare root trees, because bare root trees need to come from a nursery. And each of these different types of trees have different advantages and disadvantages. So with a bare root tree, it's significantly less expensive. Each of these potted trees is about $30, and you could probably get, 3 to 6 of these bare root trees for the same price. You also have a greater selection when it comes to bare root trees, because you can speak directly with the nursery about what you want in terms of rootstock and also variety, whereas there's a much more limited selection when you go to your local garden center to buy the trees that they already have in place. And also, when you buy a bare root tree, it's dormant, so it's less susceptible to transplant shock. And that can be convenient. It's just a smaller tree that you're planting. However, there are some advantages to the potted trees. You can go right now and get a tree from your local garden center or home improvement store and plant it. And you also have greater flexibility with your planting time, because the tree is already in a medium that it's happy in. Whereas with a bare root tree, it really needs to be planted as soon as possible after you've received it. So if you do decide to go the route of a bare root nursery tree, you should understand that nurseries or fruit trees from nurseries are in very high demand. And so you need to place your order at least 2 years in advance. That seems to be the recommendation from a lot of nurseries, is you need to really have in mind what you're trying to do 2 or more years in advance to place your order with them. When you do get your trees from the nursery, you're looking for a highly feathered tree. And feathered just means, like you see in this picture here, where there's a lot of side branches. And the reason for that is a lot of side branches is going to help you get to fruiting faster return on investment. So yes, a highly feathered tree is more expensive. However, it's faster return on investment. So you have to kind of balance those two things. You also, of course, want an abundance of healthy roots. You have a lot of biomass above the ground in a tree like this that's highly feathered. So you really need a healthy root system to support that above ground portion of the tree. You do want a tall tree, at least 5 feet tall, with a dominant straight leader. And the leader is this central trunk kind of guiding the tree vertically. That's very critical for most fruit training systems, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So in terms of your orchard design, how you'll plant the trees on your property, you want a north-south orientation. All fruit tree production is all about getting the most light interception, because when you have the most light interception, you have the greatest fruit production, you have the greatest fruit quality. Basically, you're getting the most out of the space that you have. And so it's important to have this north-south orientation to get the most sunlight, but it's also important to make sure that your trees are spaced both within the row and between the rows so that you can continue to capture that light. You do not want the trees in your easternmost row to shade the trees to the west of it. And so thinking about planting the trees at least as wide between the rows as the trees will be tall. You also need to think about having sufficient room to drive your equipment between the rows. And note also that in row spacing, so the space between trees in the row, is going to be based on your rootstock. How vigorous are those trees? How much space do they need? What is their mature size? Also, the fertility at your site. If it's a very high fertility site, you want to have a little more space between the trees. It's just very frustrating to deal with trees that are on top of each other. It takes a lot of pruning, and that's time that you might not have. And also I wanted to point out about your goals, because in this picture here, this is a U-pick orchard. And so these trees each are planted further apart than they need to be. They are dwarfing rootstock, but they're planted in this way so that customers coming to pick can walk between the rows, or rather, between trees in a row. I like to call that a pedestrian orchard, a place that you can walk through, because when you have a trellis orchard, it really restricts your ability to traverse through. And so for this U-pick operation, they decided to provide individual supports so that customers could walk through the orchard rather than having to walk around. Also, in terms of planning, you should keep in mind that cross-pollination is very important for fruit quality. Fruit sizing is, dependent on getting the most pollination and also yield. So even in fruit species or fruit varieties that are self-fertile, it helps to have another variety to cross-pollinate. And so conveniently, all you need is varieties that have overlapping bloom periods in most cases. You'll notice, I know that you can't read this pollination chart here, but you'll notice that there are some very dark red squares, and those indicate that the species on the y-axis should not, or I'm sorry, the variety on the y-axis should not be used to pollinate the variety on the x-axis. And that could be because of pollen sterility. So that's, without getting too technical, you essentially just need to be aware of the varieties that you choose and if they can be used to pollinate other varieties, or if they themselves have some kind of sterility that would prevent them from doing that. Oftentimes the nursery will recommend species to you. But if you're only planning to plant one variety of apple, you might consider planting a crab apple for pollination. Crab apples have a longer period of bloom, and they work well in a lot of cases for cross-pollination. And trellising. So we mentioned about support. If you're planning to have a high density orchard, then the trees do need support. It's important because it helps the tree put more energy into fruit production as opposed to growing a very strong trunk to help hold itself up. And in a lot of cases, it can help simplify your training. So specifically here, I'm talking about apples and well, mostly apples, because in peaches, we tend to have that open vase, it's a larger tree that doesn't need this kind of trellis support. Cherry can kind of be the same way. However, as I'll show you in a little bit, trellising, training, and pruning is kind of a black box, and there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And so I'll show you some examples later of how people have implemented trellises to improve cherry production and things like that. Even peaches can be grown on a trellis, but for a smaller scale system, just know that having some kind of support is important to help the tree maximize fruit production and protect it from wind damage, especially in its first year after planting. It's common to see anywhere from a 1-wire trellis all the way up to 5 wires. So it, again, depends on the vigor of your rootstock and the specific, even the specific variety you choose. I always rag on Honeycrisp because it's an extremely slow growing variety that needs a lot of support. And so in our case, we had, I believe, a 4-wire trellis to support them. And it is best to install the trellis prior to planting. You're not necessarily disturbing the soil to put in the trellis, but there's a lot of heavy equipment that's going in and out of the field to do that. And so it's often better to do that prior to planting. So you're finally ready to plant your bare root tree. It's best to do this in the early spring, and admittedly, we're a little bit late on giving this presentation for what might have been the optimal time for planting. However, when you do this, because maybe you're coming here and you're not planning to plant for another year or two, when your bare root trees do arrive to you, you want to keep them in a cool, dark place until you're ready to plant them. And you do want to soak the roots for at least 2 hours before planting. It just helps rehydrate them before they go into what could be a drier soil medium. You want to make sure that the hole you're digging is at least the depth of the root system. That's sort of common sense, but you also want to make sure that the hole is somewhat wider than the root system that's already in place. That way it already has loose soil to grow into. And as you're digging these holes, it's important to try to avoid working with very wet soil that would be susceptible to glazing. You'd be kind of creating, that pot, like it would hold water and prevent the roots from growing out if you're working with the soil when it's too wet. So you've got your hole, you want to put the tree in the hole such that the graft union, so where the scion, the cultivar, and the rootstock meet, ultimately will be about 3 to 4 inches above the soil line. You do want to account for settling, so it's very common to recommend that the scion, or that the graft union, is actually 6 inches above the soil line. And then as the soil is backfilled and settles through watering and time, that the graft union ends up being about 3 to 4 inches out of the soil. Again, yes, you're going to backfill the hole and tamp it down with soil. It is common for some people to take that native soil and mix it with really well aged compost, and that will just help lighten the soil as they backfill the hole. You do need to add support. So even in that first year, even if you're growing a more vigorous variety, you do want to add some kind of metal conduit. I've seen people use bamboo or other, single poles to help support that tree through the first couple years of establishment. You're going to want to water thoroughly so that you are filling in any of the air gaps that remain in that planting hole, and make sure that the roots stay hydrated as the tree establishes. And it's always recommended to add mulch to the soil, so that you're improving water management, but also weed control. So in your first year of planting, you should be focused on establishing a healthy and vigorous tree. And so I wanted to give some recommendations about how to go about doing that. In terms of fertility, it's critical that you do not put any fertilizer in the planting hole. I mentioned that, with that, in the beginning, we talked about that soil test that would need phosphorus. We would recommend that they would put that out and incorporate it well into the entire planting area several weeks in advance of planting, so that that has time to get more incorporated and not damage the roots. You do not want to add any fertilizer until that planted tree breaks dormancy. So you start to see it pushing leaves out. At that time, you can begin your split fertilizer applications. Usually you split it 2 or 3 times. Often we say to split it 3 times in a more sandy soil, or twice in a heavier soil. And I've given a specific example here with apple, where the recommendation is 0.02 pounds of nitrogen split between May, June, and July, once the tree has broken dormancy. And on young trees, especially, it's important that fertilizer be placed in the drip line. And I've included this image here to sort of explain that to you, but it's, the edges of the canopy. In terms of weed control, this is absolutely critical, because trees in their year of planting, really through the first 5 years after planting, are extremely susceptible to becoming stunted through competition with weeds. So it's very common to use wood mulch for weed control. You want to avoid using plastic mulch or landscape fabric, because rodents love to live under fabric. And they also love to eat apples. So it's important that you use wood mulch. The larger the chips, the better. They have a harder time tunneling in larger chips. And so, do not use plastic mulch. You might also use cultivation or hand weeding. Basically, by all means necessary, let that tree become vigorous with no competition as it's in its establishment period. There are limited herbicides available for use on hobby orchards, or a smaller scale orchard that's not of commercial size, that's not a commercial farm. As I mentioned, these newly planted trees are very vulnerable, and they need a weed-free environment. In addition to mulches and fabrics providing a habitat for rodents, you also need to think that if there's a lot of weeds growing up next to the trees, then rodents have a safe place to live and exist without being visible to predators. So it's important that you control the weeds around these trees, so that any predators that are in the area can see the rodents there, and it will also deter them from being there in the first place. In terms of irrigation, again, this is absolutely critical for the establishment period. You do not want the trees to struggle at all while they're trying to develop as large of a root system, as deep as a root system as they can, and try to grow up as quick as possible. Because what you're after is, how fast can you get fruit on these trees? Again, high density trees are most susceptible, because unfortunately with the dwarfing comes a smaller root system to accompany that. And, depending on the size of your operation, you might use a soaker hose if it's just a few trees on your property. You might install drip tape if you have, if you have a larger operation, and even you might also consider micro sprinklers. So I wanted to touch a little bit on training systems. Again, this is a huge topic. Several talks could be given about training and pruning systems for the different types of trees. However, there are always these general principles, especially in the establishment years. So we always want to maximize airflow. That's important for pest and disease control. And we also want to maximize light interception. As I mentioned, the more photosynthesis that you can encourage from these trees, the faster they will grow, the more fruit you will get from them, and the higher quality fruit you'll get from them. And so you want to make sure that once the tree is planted, there are no branches below 20 inches or so from the soil surface. That's so that you don't have any interference with weed control. You don't want to damage the tree through your weed control efforts by having low branches, and you also don't want low branches to be hanging down when they have heavy fruit on them. You want to promote the growth of very strong limbs. So we're talking about, branch angles to the trunk that are not too narrow. They're very susceptible to breaking. I see this a lot in the invasive Bradford pears. They have, very tight branch angles to the trunk, and they break easily. Also, you want to remove any branches competing with the central leader, that main trunk, because that is how you're controlling your upright growth. And there's an exception here for peaches, of course, because it's traditional for us to raise them, to train and prune them in that open vase method, which we'll discuss. And you want to remove root suckers, because root suckers are coming up from your rootstock, and that is not your desirable variety, and it's taking away from the energy that should be going into your desired plant. So you always want to remove your root suckers. Sorry. So as I mentioned, fruit training is a huge topic. These first two pictures on the left are a cherry system where they're growing them at an angle, and then they have multiple leaders heading up the trellis. And then the photo on the right here is, it's, a double leader, a V system in apple production. So you have one rootstock with your desirable scion that they split into 2 leaders and grew up the trellis. So I'm just trying to impress upon you that there's a lot of ways to go about this. Everybody will do it differently. You have to do what works for you. But the most important thing is to keep those general principles in mind about maximizing airflow and light interception, and also the fruiting capacity of the trees. So I wanted to touch specifically on, give an example here of an apple training system called the tall spindle. It's really come on as the most popular way to train apple trees. You have to start with a fully dwarfing rootstock, because the intention is to get your trees very close to each other. So 3 to 4 feet within the row, and then 11 to 12 feet between rows. We want that highly feathered nursery tree, as I mentioned, because you have more fruiting area, and you'll get fruit on them faster. As I mentioned, keeping the trees up out of the way of your weed control, so up about 2 feet off the ground. And this is a critical thing for the tall spindle system, is there are no permanent scaffolds, no permanent branches. We're always going in, certainly in the year of planting, but in dormancy every year after that, and removing about 2 to 3 branches, the ones that are half the diameter of the central trunk. So if there are side branches that are half the diameter of the central trunk or larger, they are competing too strongly with that central leader, and they get cut out. You're trying to put all that energy into growing up. And also removing any competitors with that leader. So you see in these trees, I hope you can see, I know it's a little small, but basically they've removed any competitors with the central leader, so it can grow completely up, and the remaining branches have all been pulled down. That prevents them again from competing with the leader, but it also, they've found, promotes early fruit production. So these are things that you would be doing in your year of planting, training this tree and getting that central leader to take the tree as high up as fast as possible. A couple more notes on the tall spindle system is you have your feathers those feathers bent down after planting, as I showed. You want to attach the tree to a support in such a way that the tree could reach a diameter of 2 inches. And so in this lower photo here, we have a U-hook that was used with a 2-inch diameter at least to hook up to this trellis. But you'll also see that the tree itself has an individual metal conduit for support. These are those Honeycrisp trees from my master's work that really need a lot of support to get them to reach that top wire. And this photo on the upper right is to show you what you can get. You see, this is basically a fruiting machine here. These are cider apples, and you know, this has got to be early in their life, maybe 3rd or 4th leaf, as we call it. The leaf describes the years after planting. And you have these skinny branches producing a lot of fruit for the age of the tree. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to mention was, you see how I cut this branch here in the lower left picture. You see how it's almost the same diameter as the trunk. So we cut that branch off. We cut it so that this little bud here below it will come out and be a replacement branch, and it will be so much smaller than the trunk that it will not be competing any longer. With peaches, you know, it's very common to have this open vase system here, where you see on the upper right. Oftentimes at planting, this begins with a heading cut. So we chop off the top of the peach tree so that we end up with our 4, oftentimes it's 4, it could be 2 or 3 even, scaffold branches that get us that open vase. We're always trying to improve airflow in our peaches. Brown rot is a major disease of peaches, and airflow really helps with that. Also, we don't have the same level of dwarfing in peaches, and so it's just a way for us to manage more branches without the height, because working on a ladder is no fun for anyone, especially on a home orchard. There have been some varieties developed to be more upright with peaches as opposed to this open look. Those are Sweeten Up and Crimson Rocket, as I've mentioned here. And then there are some varieties that are more compact. So again, there's a lot of options on the market. We have some resources to help you choose. I'll explain those later. But you have to think about what you want and then go from there, rather than just being forced to pick. This is why going with a nursery plant is better sometimes than a potted, because you're not stuck with this limited selection in front of you. Really, the world is your oyster when you're working with the nursery. A couple notes on wildlife damage control. A lot of wildlife find fruit trees very attractive. So voles and rabbits, as I mentioned, weed control is a critical part of managing those pests. But also people usually put a hardware cloth, that hardware cloth mesh, they'll form it into a cylinder shape. Like you see this black cylinder in the background is around, you know, the next tree in line here. However, they were not buried at all, and it was very easy for the rodents to get in here and cause this damage to the trunk. And basically this tree will die from this damage. So tree guards can be useful to prevent rodent damage. I've heard many people complain about squirrels in their peach trees. There's not a lot you can do about that, but it's something to be aware of if you are out, if you have bird feeders, you know, and squirrels are a large problem on your property. If you have a lot of deer, it's important to know that deer like to munch on the branches of fruit trees, and the males will also rub their antlers on the tree. So you just have to kind of take stock of the existing problems that might prevent success with fruit trees, and just take that into stock as you're planning. I wanted to put a note here on painting the trunks of fruit trees. You might have been, you know, out in a U-pick orchard, or maybe you have experience on a commercial orchard where they've painted the trunks, and they do this for several reasons, mainly to prevent winter injury, because when you're reflecting light, it prevents these trees from warming up during the heat of the winter day and then freezing real quick when the sun sets, and that can result in cracking. So you want to reflect the light with this white paint, and it can have a similar advantage for preventing sun scald. There's been some evidence that You can also prevent rodent damage by having the trees painted in this way, and also damage from borers that would significantly damage the trees. Usually we're recommending a white latex paint of interior grade, not exterior and not oil-based. Oftentimes painting it on can be more effective than spraying it on. It just ends up being a thicker coating. And it's very common to mix your paint 50-50 with water prior to application. So these are several of the Rutgers fact sheets that exist that are relevant to this topic. I wanted to include them here in case you see something that sticks out. As I mentioned, we have recommendations for variety selection, what to consider when planting an orchard, and also pest control schedules specific to home orchards. I will include this in the webinar follow-up email, so don't worry about writing all this down right now. And additional resources would be our commercial tree fruit production guides. We have one specific to New Jersey produced by several of our colleagues at Rutgers here. And then they also collaborate on the Penn State Tree Fruit Production Guide. Both of these have a lot of information about specific varieties and rootstock recommendations, as well as pollinizer choices, pest and disease concerns. So these are not for home use because or rather the pesticide recommendations in them are not for home use because simply these chemistries are not available to home orchardists. However, I do recommend them for the wealth of information in there about, these topics I mentioned, but also training and pruning. Working with fruit trees is like a lifelong pursuit. So it's important to have these resources to visit with questions. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that, being successful with fruit trees is all about planning. If you do not plan, then you really do plan to fail. You have to start off with a good site and really prepare that site because these trees are going to be there for a very long time. You want to make sure you choose the right trees for your site and for your specific situation so that you're pleased with the outcome. Always do start small, maybe start with, a few trees of one type, maybe just apple. And then you can get into other fruit trees as you get more comfortable and start to learn about the growth habit of fruit trees and their various challenges. And of course, we are available to help you with any questions that you have. If you do not find the answers in some of these resources, or you just want to bend somebody's ear about, how to go about certain things. So I, wanted to thank you for your time and provide my contact information. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you have. I certainly do not need to be an expert.
We have a few in the chat already.
Oh goodness, I did not realize.
Put your questions in the chat. We'll work through them.
Okay, let me pull up the chat here.
One of the things I wanted to caution people, if you're going to start producing fruit and then you're going to be selling it, technically you become a commercial farm and then you will need a pesticide license. So just remember that even if you're spraying organic products or whatever, as soon as you enter into the sales, you're producing it, you're going to need most likely a private pesticide applicator. But that comes up a lot in fruit, because if you plant a large enough orchard and you have the excess and you start selling it, you've actually crossed into being a farm.
Sorry, Leslie, I did not touch on nuts, but we can talk about that if you, it all starts out the same in terms of site preparation and things. Yeah, comment here about the NRCS web soil survey. It definitely is, there's a learning curve to it. We have a fact sheet on using it. I didn't include that, but I can include it in the post webinar email. Do I recommend the donut? Leslie, do you mean specific with mulch? Setting up the mulch or the donut for watering?
Basically, when you set out the mulch, that it's not right up against the trunk of the tree, that donut. Yes. Is that what you're recommending, or are you recommending it, bringing it straight up to the?
No, we always recommend that mulch is not in contact with the trunk itself. So when you put out the mulch, you know, apply it as needed, but then you have to go back and pull that mulch away from the trunk. You just don't want that excess moisture around the trunk, and you see it commonly in the landscape misapplied. You do want depth for weed control, but you do not want it in contact with the trunk. Alan asked me a direct question about deer with young trees. He fences his for years until they get to a decent size, but yes, you know, deer love the trees and they love the fruit. So you might, if deer is a large problem, you might consider building a cage for the trees out of hardware cloth. That's what I would recommend. It's a constant problem. Even when you have deer fence and they get in, they find a way to cause a lot of damage.
Here's another one for you, Kate. How deep do you dig to take a soil sample?
So I would say 12 inches. If you want to go below that, then we would recommend taking separate samples. So you would have an upper sample and then a deeper sample that would be sent to the lab separately. Do you have anything to add, Bill?
I don't. The only thing I would just caution you is take that sample in plenty of time, because lime is going to take time. If you're low on fertility, you know, it might take more than one application to get the fertility levels up. That's usually the biggest problem we have is pH, and everybody wants to come in and then 2 weeks later plant, and the pH might be like, you know, 5.2 or something like that, which is good.
Yeah, it's difficult to manage the soil at that depth as well. So I think, you know, knowing what's going on in the top 8 to 12 inches is most important for making changes. And then it's, you know, useful to know just for your information what's going on at that deeper level.
You got a question on your tall spindle system, Lisa. If you bend the feathers down, do the tips of these need to be 20 inches?
No. The thing is, in the first year, you're mainly doing this training in the first year to get off to a good start, so that central leader has all the energy to go up, and these main branches or rather these side branches are focusing on setting fruit buds for next year. So if you're cautious with your weed control in the first year, then it's okay to pull them down lower. They're just going to be that way because you're going to cut to 20 inches, cut everything below that, and then pull down even further. So no. Will you talk about fencing? Go ahead.
I was going to talk about the fencing. Any other tips for it? I mean, it's like agriculture in New Jersey. If you grow it, they will come. It doesn't matter whether you're talking corn, soybeans, fruit.
Exactly. I mean, I guess I would send people to our fact sheet on deer fencing, but it depends on the scale of what you're doing, whether, I mean, it's a huge investment. So if you're talking about on a commercial scale, then yes, I would definitely recommend it. But on a smaller scale, it's trying to find a way to work around it or minimize the damage. At least getting the trees established, and also possibly in that case growing a larger tree so that it's not as susceptible to damage and you can have those branches higher up off the ground.
Let's see, here's another one for you. Is head cutting for peaches the same as manifolding for cannabis?
We'll have to answer together because I know what heading of peaches is, but
yeah, manifolding is usually when you do 2 cuts and you're increasing your colas coming out the side, you're topping.
Yeah, I added a link at the bottom so you could see a picture of what I was talking about.
Okay, basically the concept is when you have a central leader, it's suppressing the growth of these side branches through various plant hormones. And so what we want to do is get rid of that central leader so that we can encourage the growth of all of these side branches.
Which is pretty similar to what you're trying to do.
Yeah. So yeah, you're creating more growth below by cutting off that top piece.
Got another question here. Looks like somebody's racing squirrels. recommendations for
that.
squirrels with peaches.
I've heard that so much, but I'm really not sure what people do about it, especially in a home situation. I think people will, go to extreme lengths, like even caging each one. But I'll have to look into, let me write that down, into, squirrel damage in peaches. And then I also wanted to share the web soil survey fact sheet. Okay.
Yeah, the one thing with the web soil survey is just enter your home address and just practice with it. There's so much information that's available on that. You can generate custom soil reports and everything. It's just, you got to use it to get familiar with it.
Yeah, more comments here about dealing with wildlife. I empathize. I'm just not.
The
I'll try.
recommendations for
Yeah.
additional pollinators. That's another one that's in there.
On a commercial scale, it's very common to bring in honeybees for pollination. So on a commercial scale, I would say yes, it's worth it, and it is recommended practice. But on the thing is, you have to understand that when you see trees in bloom, they're producing so many flowers, and when you have such excellent pollination, you're actually going in after and removing the majority of those fruits. Because otherwise, if you let all the flowers set fruit, you would have very tiny little fruit. And so we're going in and thinning anyway. So on a home scale for a home orchard, I wouldn't see the value in it, because ultimately you'd be going back and removing the majority of those fruit anyway. But on a commercial scale, absolutely, because you do want to have the choice of the best size and volume for those trees.
Kate, we're just about out of time. I know we try to respect everybody's time.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Alan, he asked a direct question about repainting the trees. I believe that is not on an annual basis. I think people are doing that less frequently, maybe every other year, or even less frequently than that. And
Give a plug out for the next one. Next one, we're going to do rainwater harvesting with our water resource specialist, Christopher Upton.
yeah, if you have any questions, definitely don't hesitate to send me an email. I will send a follow-up email, which has all of these resources that we discussed, as well as the ones from my presentation. And I'll also include a survey. It would be really great to hear everyone's feedback. I forgot to mention this, but if people want to drop in the chat, this is a huge topic. What other aspects of planting fruit trees do you want to know about? Is trellising a big deal? Clearly wildlife is a big thing. What people might want to learn more about, like the specific topics, so we can try to address that. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming, and hope to see you again in May. Leslie, I got you. We'll do nuts. All right. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.